I'm hoping that in these last few lectures you've been noticing a sort of developing pattern of thinking about macroeconomic issues in two different time frames. A Keynesian time frame, which is a relatively short time frame of a few years, kind of the time between recessions, and long-term time frame, which is the right neoclassical framework for thinking about long-term growth. The next two lectures we're going to think about fiscal policy using these two different main time frames. We're first in this lecture going to focus on the short term, which in this context means a few years, sort of the time period between recessions, and focus on how fiscal policy should react depending on whether an economy is in a recession or whether it's producing at or above potential GDP. So that'll be the focus of this lecture. Then the next lecture will focus on the long run, which means how fiscal policy contributes to national saving and thus affects investment, economic growth, and the balance of trade. Now, let's back up a half step here and remember what is included in aggregate demand. Aggregate demand, as we talked about in the earlier lecture, is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. That is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. Now, of those categories of aggregate demand, two of them can be particularly affected by fiscal policy, by tax policy, and spending policy. One, obviously, is government spending. If government spends a lot more money, that tends to increase aggregate demand. It's also true that the consumption category, C, and the investment category, I, can be strongly affected by tax policy as well. Tax cuts can increase consumption and investment. Tax increases could slow down consumption and investment. Thus, key point, fiscal policy has the power to shift aggregate demand. It can increase the amount of aggregate demand in the economy or decrease the amount of aggregate demand in the economy. So, we're going to think about some terminology here for when you're either increasing or decreasing aggregate demand. If you're increasing the amount of demand or buying power in the economy, we're going to call that expansionary macroeconomic policy, to expand aggregate demand. That's also sometimes called a loose policy. The idea is to put more buying power out there in the economy. So a policy of tax cuts or a policy of spending increases is an expansionary fiscal policy, to have more buying power out there in the economy. The macroeconomic policies that are used to reduce aggregate demand, in contrast, are called contractionary policies or tight fiscal policies. So a policy of tax increases or a policy of spending cuts is going to be a contractionary or a tight fiscal policy. So with this terminology in hand, we now want to think about countercyclical fiscal policy. And this word countercyclical just means that the fiscal policy in the economy is counterbalancing the business cycle of recession and recovery. So, for example, if the economy is in a recession, so it's producing less than the potential GDP it could produce, then you use expansionary fiscal policy to increase aggregate demand and push output in the economy up toward potential GDP. On the flip side, if the economy is producing at or above its potential GDP, as the U.S. economy was probably doing during what we could now call the bubble economy of the late 1990s, then you could use fiscal policy to hold down aggregate demand and prevent the economy from moving into a situation where inflation might occur with too much money chasing too few goods. So fiscal policy can be used to address these cyclical issues moving back and forth in the economy. In particular, the difficulty with a recession, remember, is that there isn't enough aggregate demand in the economy. And fiscal policy can be used to address the unemployment that results in that situation. In a recession, the government policy of spending more or taxing less would pump up aggregate demand. As there's more aggregate demand in the economy, firms are going to be more willing to hire people, and the amount of cyclical unemployment should go down. You'd want to increase aggregate demand by enough to push the economy up to its potential GDP or its full employment GDP. And in theory, you could do that either with lower taxes or with higher spending. Now again, In this approach, the issue is not looking at government spending one program at a time. We're not trying to say, does this program make sense or does that make sense? In a macroeconomic sense, all we care about is getting the economy moving, is pumping up the amount of aggregate demand. The famous economist John Maynard Keynes, in his General Theory, explained when he was inventing this approach during the great unemployment of the Great Depression of the 1930s, he argued that, it doesn't matter what you do with the money. The point is to get more aggregate demand. And so to sort of emphasize that point, he argued in this way. He said, if the Treasury were to fill old bottles with banknotes and bury them at a suitable depth in disused coal mines, which were then filled up to the surface with town rubbish, and leave it to private enterprise on the well-tried principles of laissez-faire to dig the notes up again, there need be no more unemployment. And with the help of the repercussions, the real income of the community and its capital wealth also would probably become a great deal greater than it actually is. It would indeed be more sensible to build houses and the like, but if there are political and practical difficulties in the way of this, then the above would be better than nothing. He said, ancient Egypt was doubly fortunate and doubtless owed to this its fabled wealth in that it possessed two activities, namely pyramid building as well as the search for precious metals, the fruits of which, since they could not serve the needs of man by being consumed, did not stale with abundance. The Middle Ages built cathedrals and sang dirges. 2 pyramids, 2 masses for the dead are twice as good as one, but not so 2 railways from London to New York. So the point Keynes is making there is, when you're trying to pump up aggregate demand and get more spending, it doesn't matter whether the spending is actually useful. Sure, it would be nice if it was useful. It would be nice if it could be a house or a railway. But, when you're trying to get more aggregate demand, burying money in old coal mines and having people dig it up is as good as anything. Building pyramids is as good as anything. Building cathedrals is as good as anything. From a macroeconomic point of view, the goal here is get more money in the economy. Exactly how you do it is a secondary concern from a macroeconomic point of view. It's also true that the design of tax and spending policies, as well as other regulations in the economy, could affect the natural rate of unemployment, what I'm sometimes calling the structural rate of unemployment in the economy. Remember that structural rate of unemployment, that natural rate of unemployment, is determined by the incentives that firms have to hire people and by the incentives unemployed people have to look for jobs and seek out new jobs. So, if we can affect those incentives, we might be able to have the natural rate of unemployment be somewhat lower. Now, this might involve spending more money by, say, having government programs that would support job search. It might involve redesigning how we spend money, like perhaps giving unemployment benefits in larger amounts, but for a shorter period of time. And it will also involve regulatory decisions that don't have an obvious fiscal impact, like the hours when businesses can be left open or zoning decisions and all those kinds of things. So fiscal policy will also affect unemployment in those ways. Reducing aggregate demand would bring down inflation. So if instead of fighting unemployment, we're trying to fight inflation, we need to think about a tight fiscal policy. And that tight fiscal policy would be lower spending or higher taxes. When inflation occurs, there's too much money chasing too few goods. So you can use tax increases or spending cuts so there's less money chasing the goods, a contractionary fiscal policy. Now again, notice just for a moment, this contractionary fiscal policy could happen either through tax increases or through spending cuts. The theory doesn't dictate which choice or which mix of the two might be made. That's going to be a more political decision. We'll come back to that later on. Now, the concept of countercyclical fiscal policy, that is, when aggregate demand is too low, pump it up. When aggregate demand is too high, push it down. Run against the business cycle. That whole idea leaves open some questions of how the government should implement this kind of policy. One main choice is to think about whether this countercyclical fiscal policy should be allowed to happen automatically or whether it should be done through specific acts of Congress that are passed each year. So to understand this distinction between automatic policy and discretionary policy that's passed each year. Let's start off by thinking about how does the federal budget adjust automatically in both taxes and spending when the economy goes into recession or into recovery. And the key term here that we're going to focus on is something called automatic stabilizers. The idea of an automatic stabilizer is that there are certain taxes and certain government spending that automatically help stimulate aggregate demand when the economy is declining and automatically hold down aggregate demand when the economy is expanding. So let's sort of talk about how that would happen. Let's imagine that the economy is growing very rapidly. Aggregate demand is very high. It's at or above potential GDP. We're worried about inflation taking off. So what would be the appropriate countercyclical fiscal policy in this situation, running against the cycle? The appropriate countercyclical policy for taxes would be, we want to prevent aggregate demand from going too fast. We want to prevent the economy from tipping into a situation of inflation. And so, as the economy is booming, and we're worried about it tipping into inflation, then we want to think about how could we increase taxes and take some of that buying power out of the economy. So, what actually happens in the economy as it begins to grow? Well, taxes are a percentage of what people earn, more or less. So, as the economy grows and income rises, taxes automatically go up. Indeed, the U.S. code is structured around tax brackets, the individual income tax. So as people earn more in income, the dollar paid in taxes, the taxes paid out of each additional dollar of income gradually rise. So as the economy grows, taxes rise automatically. Taxes are an automatic countercyclical fiscal policy. Taxes are an automatic stabilizer. The same process works in reverse, of course. In a shrinking economy, the taxes that people owe automatically decline because taxes are a share of income. And so this helps prevent aggregate demand from shrinking as much. In that sense, taxes on the downside also help to stimulate the economy at least a little bit in an automatic way. Now let's shift over and look at the spending side. Now on the spending side, when the economy grows, what countercyclical policy do we want to apply and what actually happens? Let's think about the economy booming. As it approaches potential GDP, the goal of countercyclical fiscal policy is to prevent demand from growing too fast and tipping the economy into inflation. Well, what actually happens with government spending? There's a number of government programs that are aimed at people who are in financial need to some extent. I'm thinking here of Medicaid, medical assistance for the poor, unemployment benefits, supplemental security income for the elderly, various kinds of welfare programs. Now, when the economy does well, when the economy has low unemployment, fewer people need these programs. And so spending from the government in these kinds of categories automatically declines because fewer people need them. So certain categories of spending aimed at people with low incomes actually have a macroeconomic justification as well as a microeconomic justification of helping people. When they're reduced, as the economy is doing extremely well, they act as automatic stabilizers. Government spending is pulled out of the economy. And the same works in reverse. In a shrinking economy, or in a recession, you could imagine that lots of people are unemployed and more people need these kinds of government programs. Well, that's when government spending on programs that help those with low incomes and help the poor tends to rise. So that increase in government spending helps prevent aggregate demand from shrinking too much. And that's exactly the countercyclical fiscal policy you would want. So let's think about these automatic stabilizer properties, especially for taxes, which are very clear in the U.S. macroeconomic experience of the late 1990s and the early 2000s. So let's return for a moment here, subject of the previous lecture, and thinking about the budget surpluses that existed in the late 1990s, from 1998 to 2001. Now, as I talked about in the previous lecture, you can mainly trace those surpluses to a surge in federal tax revenues. And remember, by 2000, taxes are tied for the highest level in U.S. history, tied with 1944 at the height of fighting World War II. Federal taxes that year collected 20.9% of GDP. But why did taxes go up so much in the late 1990s? Clinton raised taxes on those with high incomes as part of the 1993 budget. But there's no big tax increase that's enacted in 1996 or 1997. There's no official tax increase that happens. Bill Clinton's proposed budget for fiscal year 1998, which is actually published in 1997, predicted that in 1998 there would be a deficit of $120 billion. That was the prediction 1 year in the future. And it turned out to be a budget surplus of $69 billion. It was $200 billion more than they expected. The same thing happened the next year. Clinton's proposed budget for fiscal year 1999 predicted the budget would be balanced in 2000. So 1 year ahead, they were predicting a balanced budget. And it actually turned out to be a budget surplus of $236 billion. The economy brought in vastly more tax revenue than had been expected. And that was a good thing. That was an automatic stabilizer. That increase in the tax take was helping the economy from expanding too quickly and perhaps zooming into a situation where inflation would be a problem. Now, in George Bush's first term of office, the tax take falls dramatically. Remember, by 2003, the federal tax take is down to 16.4% of GDP, the lowest level since about the 1950s. Now, some of this was Bush's tax cuts in 2001 and the follow-up tax cuts enacted in 2002 and 2003. But a lot of it, maybe half of it, was not about the tax cuts at all. In August 2002, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office published a report that said, "Where did the revenues go?" That was the title of the report. Because all of a sudden, tax revenues dropped off a table by much more than they had expected, even taking the tax cuts into account. What essentially happened was the $200 billion positive surge of revenues in the late 1990s all of a sudden went away. And there was a $200 billion negative surge in the early 2000s. Now, as you look back on this, you sort of think, it kind of seems like they should have expected that, right? I mean, there's this big surprise of all this extra money coming in, and then all of a sudden there's this big surprise that it wasn't coming in anymore. You might think that when the money came in, you might suspect it was going to stop coming in at some point, but that doesn't seem to be what happened. There are long-term relationships that these models use, like the Congressional Budget Office models, where they look at the size of the economy and the tax code and tax revenues. And what apparently happened in these models is they didn't take into account very well the impact of the stock market on tax revenues. And so what happened, in fairness to them, by the late 1990s, there are a lot of new things happening in the stock market in terms of stock options and widespread ownership of mutual funds. And the rapid growth in the stock market in the 1990s was pumping up people's incomes because of the stock options they were cashing in, the gains they were getting from their mutual funds and their investments. And by pumping up income, that was pumping up taxes. Then in 2001, the stock market stops going up, declines somewhat, and that extra revenue that was being generated goes away. But here's my key point. It's not really a point about what happened in that particular time frame. My key point is that the tax code acted as an automatic stabilizer for the economy. By that increase in taxes helped keep the economy from surging into inflation in the late 1990s. And that decrease in taxes helped keep the recession in 2001 short and shallow. And it did that essentially without Congress passing any laws at all. It was an automatic stabilizer. More broadly, if you look over the years, there's systematic evidence that shows the impact of countercyclical fiscal policy over time. The fine macroeconomist John Taylor at Stanford University, no relation to me, looked at evidence from the 1960s up through 2000. And he found that on average, a 2% fall in the economy, in GDP, led to a 1% of GDP offsetting increase in fiscal policy. So this automatic policy, most of this was automatic policy, not new laws that were passed. So spending and the tax code adjust in an automatic way to offset what else is happening in the economy. Now, given the presence of these automatic stabilizers and the way in which taxes and spending automatically offset some of the swings in the economy, the controversy then arises, should Congress go further? Should Congress attempt to enact additional discretionary countercyclical fiscal policies that would go beyond the automatic policies and attempt to stabilize the economy even more? The idea would be that when the economy is in recession, sure, we know taxes go down and spending goes up automatically, but should we give the economy an even bigger boost, even bigger tax cut, even bigger spending increase? When the economy is doing really well, when it's booming, when it's near potential GDP, should we know that there'll be an automatic increase in taxes and an automatic reduction in spending, but should we try and cut spending even further or raise taxes even further? Should we go beyond the automatic stabilizers and enact discretionary policy? Well, back in the 1960s and even into the 1970s, there was a fairly widespread belief among economists in using discretionary policy. But in the last 20 years or so, since probably the mid-1980s, economists have moved away from discretionary fiscal policy. And let me try and explain sort of the main reasons why that shift has occurred. One difficulty is a problem of timing. These automatic adjustments in taxes and spending that I was describing earlier essentially happen immediately. They're built into the spending programs, they're built into the tax code. So they happen almost in real time or within a year. But if you think about discretionary fiscal policy, then you have a real problem of timing. Imagine, for example, that you're sitting in Congress, it's 2000, and all of a sudden a recession is happening. You think to yourself, oh boy, a recession has started. Well, normally the new budget gets submitted to Congress in February. You can send tax laws through Congress anytime, but in practice, Congress seems able to handle about one big tax law change per year, one big budgetary package per year, and they argue and argue all year long. Eventually, they pass something. So let's say that in 2001, you notice there's a recession, you want to do something about it, and you start arguing about it. You put a bill into the hopper, and it begins to work its way through the process. Eventually, the bill passes at the end of the year, and it begins to actually have an impact in 2002. And since it takes time for these programs to kick in, it's probably reasonable to say that from the moment you think about the recession to when the bill actually has some economic impact is probably 18 months or something like that. At which point, the economic problem might be completely different. I mean, the recession of 2001 was over in November of 2001. So passing something that would have an effect in 2002 isn't obviously a great idea. So one problem with discretionary fiscal policy is it takes so long. It takes so long legally to pass the budget, to pass tax changes, and for them to have an impact. You do end up with these odd situations with discretionary fiscal policy. I'll give you a recent example. Remember that George W. Bush is arguing for tax cuts in the election campaign of 2000. That's when the economy is booming. He's arguing for tax cuts on the grounds that the government has enormous surpluses and is collecting way too much revenue. But then when the tax cuts are actually enacted in 2001, the economy is in a recession. At which point the argument is, well, we need the tax cuts to stimulate the economy out of recession. So the argument for why we should enact discretionary policy was totally different in 2001 than it was in 2002. And in that particular case, it actually worked. The tax cuts that had been argued for in 2000, when they arrived in 2001, arrived at just the right time to help the economy out of recession. But this hardly seems like a sensible way to think about fiscal policy over time, sort of hoping that a year from now you'll have the right policy in effect. Another difficulty with fiscal policy is that fiscal policy can have side effects. And these side effects may be undesirable. If you're running, for example, a loose fiscal policy and you're trying to stimulate the economy, you're going to be probably boosting the budget deficit. Going to be big tax cuts, perhaps spending increases. The combination of those two leads to a large budget deficit. Now, what happens if you have large budget deficits? Some of the possibilities are that the federal government might be sopping up all the money that was otherwise available for domestic investment. That's not a consequence you want. Or it might be that the extra demand that the government is creating all ends up buying imported products rather than domestic products. And so you're pumping up the economy, but it's not the US economy that's being pumped up, it's the economy of China or India or Mexico, and we're buying imports instead and having a really large trade deficit. Now, obviously, tight fiscal policy has trade-offs too, but my point here is that it's hard to calculate if you're thinking about a discretionary fiscal policy in a complicated economy. You start having to think about, well, if we do that, what will be the trade-offs in terms of investment? What will be the trade-offs in terms of the trade balance? What will be the trade-offs in terms of this and that? And those are hard questions. Those are legitimately difficult questions in a complicated and intertwined macroeconomy. And in that situation, you might say to yourself, well, let's let the automatic stabilizers work, but let's not go into this sort of swamp of what might happen if we try and enact really large discretionary policies when we're not altogether sure what some of the trade-offs might be. Another difficulty with discretionary fiscal policy is really a political difficulty. And it's the political difficulty with trying to get politicians to enact countercyclical behavior. Since the Great Depression, since the time of Keynes, many economic policymakers have called for the government to take countercyclical fiscal policy. That is, spend in bad times, be tight-fisted in good times. But politically, this is tough. I mean, think about it for a moment. The economy is growing very quickly. Tax money is flooding in. And economists say, don't spend it. Build up a really big surplus. Cut spending, raise taxes. You'll need that someday. That's countercyclical policy. In good times, have a tax increase and a spending cut. That's not an easy sell politically. When the economy is shrinking and money is tight, economists say, hey, this is a fabulous time for a spending spree. We know there's no tax money. Spend anyway. That can be a hard sell to the public and a hard sell to a lot of legislators. The sort of intuition of contracting the government when it's going really well and pumping up in bad times is not as obvious as you might think politically. A final issue is that there are monetary policies run by the Federal Reserve. Now, we're going to talk about these in more detail in later lectures, and so I don't want to assume that you know a lot about them now. But I'll just say here that monetary policies and the Federal Reserve managing to increase or reduce interest rates offers an alternative policy for the short-term management of aggregate demand. Specifically, that policy is that the Federal Reserve can reduce interest rates to help stimulate aggregate demand, or the Federal Reserve can increase interest rates to hold down aggregate demand. And so, given that there is this other set of policies, this other set of monetary policies, which can be used in a discretionary way to help increase or decrease aggregate demand, using discretionary fiscal policy is somewhat less attractive. You've got another option, so you don't have to use discretionary fiscal policy. Now again, in a few lectures we'll talk about monetary policy in more detail and exactly how the Federal Reserve carries out those policies. But my basic bottom line is just to let you know that it does have that power to do that in the short run, and as a result, the Federal Reserve can often react more quickly than the government in terms of the government passing new budgets and new tax legislation. And so often there's a sense that we should let the Federal Reserve handle the short term, let the automatic fiscal stabilizers handle the short term, and then don't use discretionary fiscal policy except in very extreme cases. When we think about the idea of using this discretionary fiscal policy in the long run, what I want to think about is that really, what we might want to think about with our discretionary fiscal policies is to focus them instead on the long term. We don't want to think about political issues and tax cuts and government spending. I mean, tax cuts and government spending are hot button political issues in U.S. politics. I mean, you think about Ronald Reagan's tax cuts in the 1980s. You think about George W. Bush's tax cuts in the 2000s. Government spending is a political hot button. In broad terms, with some exceptions, conservatives are going to line up on the side of tax cuts and lower spending. Liberals are going to line up on the side of tax increases and higher government spending. The real point I guess I want to leave you with here is that countercyclical fiscal policy takes no side at all in this political dispute because it always offers you both a conservative and a liberal option. Say, for example, that you think expansionary fiscal policy is needed. Well, you could expand aggregate demand either with tax cuts, that is the conservative view, or with spending increases, the liberal view. Or say that there's contractionary fiscal policy that's desired. You want to reduce aggregate demand. You could do that with tax increases, which I'll call for the sake of argument the liberal policy, or spending cuts, the conservative policy. So economists with different political beliefs will often disagree on how to conduct these policies. And they'll disagree along predictable partisan lines just like everyone else. The point of economics is to help you clarify the range of the political choices and the trade-offs between making certain choices. But the political choices themselves remain up to you.